everybody, welcome to Hope for Our Times. Thank you for joining us today. And as promised, I have my outstanding guest and good friend Alex Newman is joining us today from Liberty Sentinel. Also, you know him, you've seen him on CNN, Fox, all the mainstream media outlets, amongst many other places. Thank you, Alex, for joining us today. Great to have you here.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
And you're recently on Stephen Gardner's program, too, by the way. I know many of you have probably seen Stephen Gardner. A fantastic job on there. And thank you again for joining me. And by the way, Alex is also the author of Deep State, The Invisible Government Behind the Scenes, amongst many other works. And we're going to be going into some very interesting things. Stargate was just announced yesterday, so the last 24 hours has gotten a whole lot of attention, where we look at AI. It looks like Russia may be breaking up into possibly different parts. Trump administration and all the executive orders. Alex, let's just start here. Let's just start with Russia, because in my mind, Bible prophecy, Ezekiel 38 is a big deal, but now it appears Putin may be on his way out and Russia may be breaking up into smaller sections. But what are your thoughts on Russia, Putin, and what we see happening?
Thanks, Tom. And, I've been studying Vladimir Putin for over a decade. I first really got interested back in 2014 when the whole mess was going on with the Obama administration and Ukraine. And, of course, the State Department and the CIA had deployed a bunch of flunkies over there to support this revolution. And there was a lot of discussion among conservatives and among Christians in America about whether Putin was a good guy or a bad guy. And I didn't really know. I knew he came out of the KGB. I had my suspicions. He had been the head of the successor to the KGB. And, typically those aren't the nice people that move up the ranks and end up in positions like that. But, on the surface, at least, he pretends to be a Christian. He's got nice words for the Orthodox Church. And so I started digging into him. And what I found very quickly made me realize that the propaganda version of Putin bears very little resemblance to the real Putin. I started digging even into his statements on Christianity. He said, and I have him on video in a Russian documentary, saying that Christianity and communism are very similar. And I was like, oh, okay, then you have a very different understanding of Christianity than I do and than the Bible teaches. So I knew something was very fishy there. I believe Putin is a critical player in this effort to build a new world order. And I also believe that he's an existential threat to the United States of America. And I don't say that to try to justify a war. I don't think the United States ought to be going into wars to overthrow foreign powers. But I think he's very dangerous. And I think there are forces within Russia that would like to overthrow him, and rightfully so. He's not a nice guy. I don't think he has won legitimate elections. But I think the news of his demise may be a little bit premature. And I still believe that there's a real prospect that the United States could end up in a major war with Russia and China. I think a lot of analysts today look at Russia and China as independent players. You often hear these national security experts saying that, we don't want to drive Russia and China together. They're inseparable, and they have been inseparable going back to the propaganda about the Sino-Soviet split. And when the Soviet Union fell, there was a huge propaganda campaign to make people believe that now there was going to be reforms and they were going to have democracy and they were going to have capitalism. But a couple of books that I had read, and I highly encourage people who are interested in this to look at them. They were written by a KGB defector. He came out of the Department D, the Disinformation Department, and he warned the West. He actually first he warned the intelligence agencies of the West, then he warned the people of the West in a couple of books that were published in the early 1980s, New Lies for Old and the Perestroika Deception. He said that the Soviets were planning for long-range disinformation. He gave a series of, 206 very specific predictions about what was going to happen. He said there would be fake anti-communist revolutions in Eastern Europe. They would take down the Berlin Wall, and it would all culminate in the supposed collapse of the Soviet Union. That it would break up and Russia would kind of be the main successor to the Soviet Union, but it would ostensibly break up. But he said all the same people are going to stay in power. This isn't going to be like when the Nazi regime fell, that we put all these criminals on trial and executed many of them. He said they were going to rebrand themselves. They'd be businessmen and leaders of new political parties. And that's exactly what happened. So out of those 206 predictions, about 200 have come true to the letter. And he says the final piece of this puzzle. The final prediction he made is that there was going to be what he described as a second October revolution that would result in a global conflagration with the Communist Chinese, the Russians, and the allies around the world trying to impose on the whole planet the monstrous diabolical system that enslaved the people of the Soviet Union and the people of China. And I don't think they have given up on that dream. I don't think a lot of analysts in the West understand that. Of course, this defector, Anatoly Golitsyn, I don't think he had the full picture. He didn't have access to the information that we have access to. And I would encourage, but actually I've got a whole bunch of books on this subject. Here's one right here I just finished. The Best Enemy Money Can Buy by Anthony Sutton, a historian from Stanford University. Of course, he worked with our mutual friend Patrick Wood on the great book Trilaterals Over Washington. He did a whole bunch of these books. He did Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. What he showed is that the Soviet regime, the Bolsheviks, came to power with the deliberate support of the Wall Street mega banks, the deep staters, if you will. And so Anatoly Golitsyn didn't understand all that, but I think they are planning for some sort of global cataclysm involving Russia, China, versus, say, NATO, whatever, and maybe Ukraine will be the trigger point. And I'm just looking at the news today, and you see Donald Trump saying bad things about Putin and warning him about crazy sanctions if he won't stop the stuff in Ukraine. I think a lot of people think that because if Trump was elected, everything's all good now, peace is going to reign supreme, and I'm just not so convinced. So would Putin allow Russia to fall apart on his watch? I doubt it. Would he murder huge numbers of people to prevent something like that happening? Absolutely. And, are we still facing the possibility of a major international war? I think absolutely.
Wow. There's a lot there. Let me ask you about China. I keep reading about China's economy. They're in trouble. Their one-child policy has also caused an enormous problem for China. So what do you see China's future? Okay, you see them being buddies with Russia. They've been that way for a long time, as you mentioned. But where do you see this going? Because it appears to me they're in a lot of trouble, which could drive them to say, hey, we have no option but to be engaged in war.
Yeah, and I think that's a real concern. Communist China, of course, is filled with very serious problems, and the regime tries to kind of hide that with propaganda and fudging the numbers, very much like the U.S. government does, although they're a little bit more successful because if anybody speaks out, they just throw them in a camp. And it's a little harder to do that in the United States. But I think they're in big trouble economically. They're in big trouble demographically. If you look at the situation with the population in China now, it is going to be an absolute disaster. I think the CCP is hoping that between AI and robotics and things like this, that they'll be able to try to mitigate some of that damage. But they're in huge trouble because of the one-child policy. They've basically exterminated hundreds of millions of people who otherwise would be there, who otherwise would be supporting the older generation, paying the taxes. So they're in real trouble. But they're preparing for war against not just Taiwan, but against the United States. And this isn't like my opinion. You don't have to read between the lines. It's very open. They're preparing their children for war. They're teaching them that the United States is the enemy. We've actually got policy documents from the People's Liberation Army where they talk about unrestricted warfare, which is what they say they're waging against the United States right now. It's basically everything involving warfare except the shooting, the missiles, etc. And that part will come eventually. So I think at some point within the next few years, and it could even be within the next few months, but I think they're going to try to wait until they are absolutely sure from their perspective that they would defeat the United States. They want to take over Taiwan. And they understand that there's a real chance that the United States might intervene. And so they want to be prepared to be able to fight Japan, the United States, and anyone else that may come to their aid, maybe the Filipinos, whoever might decide to help Taiwan. And unfortunately, they're getting closer and closer to that. They're diverting huge amounts of money into shipbuilding. They've got a massive technological prowess now. They've stolen basically all of our most advanced technology, sometimes with the deliberate connivance of our politicians and business leaders and academic institutions. So this is a threat to watch. I think it's very dangerous. They're building up a massive military power, and they're not doing it just to play around in their own backyard. This is for global power projection, and we need to keep our eyes on it.
So when I look at it, I have a hard time thinking that China would want to actually enter into a direct war with the U.S., at least at this point. And this is me thinking. I'm not a war expert or anything. But I do look at the borders of the United States. They've been completely blown open over the last 4 years. We know that. There are an awful lot of Chinese nationals that are here. I do know just a few miles from where I am, there's a camp of known Chinese that are out in the middle of the hills heading up towards the mountains. And they're living out there. You know, what are they doing out there? You know, we found out about the sleeper cells. We've known about them for years with Islamic regimes. So when you see a war, I mean, do you see China coming into a direct attack, like off the coast of the West Coast or something like that, or do you see something on the inside? When we read history, you look back to Alexander the Great, and then other war leaders throughout history, you learn about the fifth column. And within the United States, we have the fifth column, I believe, that has come through the schools with the wokeness that's been taught, but also through the borders that have been open and it's inside. So we have this problem on the inside too. But what are your thoughts going forward with an actual war here on the U.S. soil?
Yeah, I think it's a very real possibility, Tom. And one of the things we know, you pointed out the open border, we know that they have inserted enormous numbers of highly trained operatives through our border. And Congress did some research on this. They held hearings on this. I mean, they have a good sense of what's been going on. The Communist Chinese were paying members of the Biden family, who now all got really weird pardons. I don't know why you would need to pardon innocent people. And as part of that, they have massive numbers. I mean, probably brigades worth of highly trained operatives all across our country. And for the most part, these people are keeping their heads down. You know, they're working as busboys. They're working as, street sweepers and things like this. And they're not getting any parking tickets. They're not getting any speeding tickets. They're just looking like regular old illegal immigrants, you know, just here for a better life. But they know how to make explosives. They know where the critical infrastructure is. And at the same time, our customs agents have caught huge containers full of fully automatic weapons coming through our ports. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that some of these huge container ships and these containers actually don't contain goods that they're shipping here, but actually contain rocket launchers, missile launchers, very, very advanced weaponry that could be deployed against the United States. So we have a big advantage in that we're surrounded by oceans, but the Communist Chinese have been dealing with that problem through a variety of different means. They've got massive naval capabilities right now. They've got weapons technology that is very, very advanced. And if and when a war were to break out, they've got operatives all across this country ready to plunge the United States into darkness, whether through attacking our electrical grid, our critical infrastructure. It could get really bad really quickly. And I don't say that to scare people. I say that because it's true. And I think that Xi Jinping, when he thinks the time is right, would be more than happy to fight a war. And from his perspective, domestically, might be really nice to have something to distract people from the catastrophe that is unfolding there in terms of the economy and in terms of the demography. And plus, they've got tens of millions of Chinese men that are never going to be able to find a wife. They murdered all the baby girls that would have eventually grown up to be wives for those men. And so one easy way to dispose of them would be, hey, send them to America, right? Let the Americans slaughter them. And people don't like to think about this stuff, and normal people don't think in these terms because we're just thinking about our immediate needs and feeding our family. But the reality is there are evil people in the world, and we need to be aware that these kinds of plans are being made. They have been made over many years. And, we don't want war, but war may be coming.
You mentioned Putin earlier being a significant player in the building of this last days empire. When I look at it, that way I say, okay, when I recognize the Bible, you're going to have 10 different kings, which I believe is really speaking of regional kings. I could be wrong on exactly how that develops, but I do believe that's what it is. But when you see, so as Putin being a significant player in the building of this, yet he seems so anti-globalist at the same time, unless he's the global king, unless he's the one who's going to come out on top, which I guess all of these guys are really these megalomaniacs. They've got huge egos and they want to be the king of the world. So when you say significant player, or I forget the exact words you used, how does that fit with this war against the West and what appears to be Western globalism?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. And this is something I've written very extensively about in the New American Magazine over the last decade. I'm glad you mentioned the regions. Very few people realize in the West that Putin is actually one of the key players driving the regionalization of the world. In his own backyard, he's building what they call the Eurasian Economic Union, which is, of course, the precursor to the Eurasian Union. And they're bringing together a lot of the former Soviet states, Kazakhstan, Belarus, etc., into this regional order. And he has talked publicly, going back to 2008, about eventually merging that with the European Union, creating this giant mega bloc that would go from Lisbon to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. So he's very much into this subversion of national sovereignty and the nation state and the emergence of these regional governments. In fact, he's leading the charge in his region of the world. Then you look at his relationships with the Western globalists. Henry Kissinger, who just passed away not that long ago, was a very, very close buddy of Vladimir Putin. They described themselves as good friends. Kissinger would go to Moscow, and Putin would have a big military parade, and they'd break out the guns, and they'd give him medals and awards for being such a great statesman. Like, what? Really? And then Putin would go to New York, and he'd have a private dinner at Kissinger's house, and, they just, in Putin's own autobiography, he talks about his very close friendship with Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was the poodle of the Rockefellers, and basically the architect of the strategy for the New World Order through the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. And of course, Putin was a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, as Klaus Schwab famously said at Harvard. So none of that makes sense in the context of Putin really being this Christian nationalist who's trying to preserve Christendom in Russia from the advancing forces of Western heathenism and paganism and LGBTism. That doesn't make sense in that context. So how does that all fit in then with the war? We've talked about this a little bit before, Tom. The globalists understand and have publicly articulated their understanding that war is the most effective means for advancing the cause of globalism. They said so in their own documents. They have proved it over and over again. World War I, of course, the League of Nations was born. The only reason that didn't burgeon out into a real global government was because the U.S. Senate refused to get us involved in that. Then we had World War II, where they built the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Coal and Steel Community, which eventually became the European Union. And so back in the 1960s, the U.S. State Department hired a guy, Lincoln Bloomfield, to write a report on how do we get to a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. It was the title of the report. And his conclusion was very simple. War and the threat of war is the fastest way to accelerate this process. So from the perspective of the satanic mastermind, if you will, that wants this one world, barbaric, savage, totalitarian system, if you use a war between two opposites, the East and the West, or the Eurasian versus NATO, whatever, then that culminates in, hey, we can't take this war anymore, we can't do this anymore, if we just have a one world system, maybe we won't have wars anymore, and that convinces a normal everyday person to be okay, at least, with the idea of surrendering sovereignty to these regional and then ultimately global institutions.
Wow, that is great, especially when we think of what's going on in the Mideast right now, because that seems to be the sentiment. We're just done with war. We just want peace, which I want to ask you about that in a minute, too, because I came across this article this morning about the Mideast being this other region because of what's been happening there and the current ceasefire. But in this book, Deep State, I find this so fascinating. You have in here China, a tool in creation of the deep state, along with creating a new world order out of regional orders. It just fits so well biblically as we look at everything moving forward. But people they cry out for peace and they cry out for safety when everything is falling apart. I remember a friend of mine was telling me in a conversation many years ago, he said, when Rockefeller says to buy, he says, when there's blood in the streets, that's when you buy. Everybody's ready to sell. So when you hear statements of a Klaus Schwab say, by 2030, you'll own nothing and be happy. So you create war, you have a collapsed economy, you have these different things. It just gives the people at the top, who are the puppet masters, it gives them the power. And when everybody else owns nothing, who's going to own it? Somebody's going to own it, and it's going to be them. So everything is definitely heading that direction. Alex, I have several more questions I still want to ask you, so I'm going to keep moving on. One of them is going to be in a couple of minutes, just about Stargate and AI, and then the executive orders that have come into play over the last 48 hours. But before we go there, let me ask you about the Mideast ceasefire. We see it in play, but there is this cry for peace right now. I'm glad that the hostages are being released. You know, that's some are not going to be alive. We know that, but it's horrific. I can't imagine a family member, your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, whatever it may be, little babies being taken hostage. I can't imagine living with that torment. I met a gentleman a year ago over in Israel where his son was one of them that was taken hostage. And and just watching him just weep as he's telling me the story. But at the same time, 1,000 terrorists are let out. You created the Hamas problem isn't dealt with, but you bring in Trump, you bring in MBS, you bring in a ceasefire, this goal towards the Abraham Accords and so forth. The people there want peace, but as you look at it, what are your thoughts as we see things develop?
Well, the U.S. government, unfortunately, has a nasty habit of forcing the Israelis to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do and that they probably shouldn't do if they were just looking out for their own interests and their own security. And unfortunately, we've seen that under both parties, right? Republicans and Democrats. Even the whole two-state solution. I mean, like, what? That really doesn't make any sense. They already did the two-state solution. They gave the Arabs the Transjordan, right? Why are we talking about another state? And then you have people talking about tons of different states. This is really, really silly. I don't think Washington, D.C. needs to be telling the Jews what they ought to be doing. And of course, that's the sentiment of a lot of the people that I have spoken with in Israel. Like, why are you guys trying to get us to make these really bad deals that are going to ultimately harm our security, harm our ability to defend ourselves? And I think we may be seeing something like that again. And so that concerns me greatly. And there also is, just to continue on this topic of regionalism, there is an effort to build a Middle Eastern Union. And then that's not my opinion. These people have talked about it openly. The Council on Foreign Relations, I call that the deep state headquarters here in the United States, they have been pushing for years the idea of a Middle East Union. We're just going to put the Jews and the Turks and the Arabs and the Persians and the Kurds all under this one regional super state. And they say the European Union can be the model. Those crazy Europeans were always fighting each other. And then once we built the regional government and took their national sovereignty, look, they're not fighting anymore. If we could just do the same thing with the Jews and the Arabs and the Persians and the Turks and the Kurds, wouldn't it just be a glorious utopia? And of course, the Jews don't want that, the Turks don't want that, the Arabs don't want that, the Persians don't want that, and the Kurds don't want that. So why in the world are we talking about that? Well, it's because the globalists have a plan. And they see the Jews as pawns in this. They see the Arabs as pawns in this. They see the Turks as pawns in this. And so it's a very, very dangerous game that these people are playing. And I don't mean to imply here, Tom, that there's necessarily some sort of like secret smoky room where all these leaders are coming together and conspiring with each other to take over the world. I mean, there is some of that going on, to be clear. But ultimately, we're talking about a satanic plan that in many cases influences people beyond the physical realm in ways that aren't necessarily understood by people. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here. So I would caution the Jews in Israel and the Arabs to be very careful about what you agree to when negotiators from the U.S. State Department show up, when Council on Foreign Relations operatives start telling you what you need to do to achieve peace. You ought to regard that very suspiciously. Of course, we need to get the hostages back, and of course, we want the shooting to stop, but we don't want to inadvertently make really bad deals that could end up hurting everybody and further advancing the cause of evil. So I think everybody needs to really think carefully about this, and we need to make sure that our policymakers in the United States aren't imposing bad things on the region.
Yeah, it's to me, I'm very concerned about it. Here's this article out of YNet News this morning. Abraham's Shield Plan is a roadmap for meeting the regional dynamics after war. A comprehensive strategy proposed by Israel's Coalition for Regional Security aims to stabilize the Mideast through Saudi normalization, Palestinian separation, and a united front against Iran. I mean, so this goes back to what you're saying earlier. You go to war, people will start crying out for peace at any cost. We know things are developing that way, but it appears that we are watching the development again of this 10 regional world. If I'm interpreting the Bible correctly, is rapidly heading that way. And so I'm going to, let me ask you, I'm going to switch gears again regarding Stargate, because that's made a lot of news over the last 24 hours. You start thinking artificial intelligence. We have quantum technology. We have Starlink. So we're watching things move forward in AI. You've written extensively about AI too. What are your thoughts on this moving forward?
Well, I'm very concerned about the development of AI and especially the people and the forces behind it. And if you just listen to them carefully, the people driving this, it should be enough to make any Christian at least pause and think, right? When you have Elon Musk saying, we're basically raising a demon here, it's like, wait, what did he just say? And I've got him on video saying we're basically raising a demon here. When you hear Bill Gates talk about we're going to need a new religion to be able to incorporate the paradigm shift that we're going to see as a result of AI, that's pretty creepy. When you hear Yuval Noah Harari from the World Economic Forum talking about AI being capable of writing the first holy book written by a superhuman intelligence, all the other ones like the Bible, that's just trash, but AI is going to write us a new one, and that one's going to be legit. We really should pause and think about what's going on here. Now, on one level, AI is a tool. It's a computer program that can make life easier, that can liberate humans from certain types of grudging labor. And in that sense, that's a welcome development. But when you realize the power of this thing and you realize the people behind it and their agenda, that should greatly concern us. So I'm very concerned about the very rapid development and deployment of AI. And in the context of what we're seeing right now in the United States, to go back to the regional government for a minute, we're now seeing very open efforts to bring the United States and Canada together on commercial things and on technology and on AI. Should we really be doing that? What's the real agenda here? Talking about merging the United States with Canada. There's been an agenda to create a North American Union for many years. We have the documents from the U.S. government talking about a North American Parliament, a North American currency, and what they're talking about doing here with the AI, massive electricity consumption that would involve bringing the power grids together between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, transportation corridors. We're watching a repeat of what happened in Europe, just with some slightly modified pretexts and justifications for bringing it about. So I'm very concerned about the development of AI. I'm very concerned about the broader context that's all happening in. Of course, I like a lot of what Donald Trump is doing, but I think we need to pay attention to all of this and be a little bit skeptical. AI, again, can be a helpful tool, but it can also be very, very, very dangerous. And I think there are actually spiritual and biblical implications here.
Yeah. Also, when I look at it, okay, with Trump, he's got Elon Musk on board. You start looking at some of the people that he's surrounded with. If we go back to his first administration, there were obviously some very nefarious people that he had surrounded himself with in his presidency. But we look at it this time, and we have this dynamic, which is concerning when you start looking at AI and the control of everything, the control of the masses. That's a big concern. And then I'm curious as to your thoughts on this too, on the executive order. So Trump has just been going through executive orders. Some of it is to me, it's great joy, dealing with DEI and gender, the evil of gender, and cutting off body parts of children in schools and not telling parents, and really going after these things are necessary. But on the other hand, we have some concerning things with the executive orders. What kind of checks and balances are there in place for Trump to, because some things are great and some things are not so great.
Yeah, that is a great question, Tom. And I'm looking at these executive orders too, and on some of them it's like, yes, that's great. And a lot of this is just reversing the crazy stuff that Joe Biden did with executive orders. And so, that's entirely appropriate. If something illegitimate came down from an executive order from Joe Biden, of course, President Trump ought to be reversing that. But, we need to understand there's a time and a place for executive orders, right? Order more paper clips for the office, pay special attention to the enforcement of this regulation. That's fine. But we have a Congress, and the Constitution vests all legislation legislative powers in Congress. And so really we want the lawmaking to be done by our elected representatives who put their hand on the Bible and swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States. That's the way things should work. But we've moved for many generations now to this view of the presidency as this sort of dictatorial, imperial role that, the president is the only one in charge. And that's very dangerous. Our founding fathers understood human nature. That's one of the big reasons why they wanted to separate power. They understood that the Bible teaches that the heart of man is desperately wicked, and they didn't believe that we ought to be trusting any person, even if we really like that person, with that kind of power. So they broke power up horizontally through the three branches. They broke power up vertically through the federal versus state sovereignty. Right? The states retained all the powers that they didn't delegate to the federal government. And so I've been very pleased with what we've seen so far from Donald Trump. But we also need to recognize that as long as that just stays as an executive order, well, 4 years from now, we're going to have another election. And 4 years from now, we have a real prospect of another Democrat coming in. And then we're going to just see the same thing again, just executive orders to reverse it all. So I think what really should be happening here is we should be going to God. We should be going to the Bible for wisdom on governance, on why do we even have government in the first place? That's something that I've taught on in churches across the country. The Bible teaches more about government than it does about heaven. So it's kind of important that as Christians we understand that. And then we have our founding documents that are supposed to set up the framework for our government that increasingly are ignored. And it was a very good framework, not perfect. I'm not one who believes it was necessarily divinely inspired, as some people will tell you, but it was the product of a lot of careful consideration by men who were mostly biblically minded and who wanted to incorporate biblical principles into government. So I think we need to go back to that. And again, most of the executive orders that I've seen so far, great common sense stuff. Federal agencies shouldn't be hiring people based on the skin color or their gender. We should not be using federal power to censor Americans. These are great things. These are common sense things. These are obvious things. But we've got to get back to a proper understanding of the role of government and a proper understanding of the constitutional framework that lays out how that government is to operate. And of course, we as Christians, especially in a country where we the people are the sovereigns, we ought to be active participants in that, not just voting every 4 years, but keeping ourselves informed, working with our elected officials, trying to bring the Word of God into every public area so that the people who are making these decisions know, well, here's what God says about this, and you ought to keep that in mind as you're making decisions that are going to affect the lives of your constituents. Mm-hmm.
I have a couple more questions to ask you. One of them is going to be about tariffs in a second, but before I ask you that, how can people connect with you?
Well, thank you so much, Tom. My personal website is libertysentinel.org, libertysentinel.org. People can sign up for our newsletter there for free. Sentinel is spelled Sentinel. We're also on all the social medias. We're on X, Alex Newman _JOU, and at LibertySent. And then I serve as senior editor of The New American. People can check that out at thenewamerican.com. And those are some of the ways. So.
Yeah, great. By the way, Alex has a whole lot of books, too. You can check out everything that he has on his website. We also happen to have Deep State right here at Hope for Our Times. You can check that out. And I would encourage you, subscribe to his newsletter. You'll be super blessed. I get it in my inbox. I'm pretty sure I get it every day. There's something that comes in from you every day, even if it's somebody else that wrote it. But it's just fantastic. Okay, let me ask you this. We only have a few minutes left, but with the reintroduction of tariffs on imports, how do you anticipate these trade policies will influence the U.S. economy and its relationship with neighboring nations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know I love economics. I taught economics for 12 years. It's a passion of mine. I think it's an important field. And I know your average economist will tell you tariffs are terrible and all the rest of it. I am not one of those people. I think there is a time and a place to use tariffs, especially when you have the rigged international trading system where American companies are paying far more in taxes, where the World Trade Organization discriminates against Americans and promotes the Chi-Coms. So I actually like the idea of using tariffs not just to protect our industries, but more importantly, as a source for raising revenue. For hundreds of years, most of the revenue in our country was actually coming in through tariffs. The idea of imposing direct income taxes on Americans would have been unthinkable to people 150 years ago. And so I think we need to go back to that. I like the idea of sticking the IRS on foreigners rather than Americans. That sounds like a great idea to me. And I think it's also a way to try to bring back into balance some of our trading issues. Like if you look at our relationship with communist China and even our relationship with Mexico and Canada, there needs to be some rebalancing here. So I'm hopeful that Trump, and I know some of the guys working on these policies, Peter Navarro, I'm a big fan. He's been on my show many times. And I think he understands this very, very well. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some good developments from this. Obviously, there will be pain for some sectors of the American economy. I'm trying to build my farm right now, and building materials are probably going to go up in price. That hurts, right? So some people are going to end up paying higher prices for certain things. But over the long run, I think it'll be helpful for the U.S. economy. I think it'll be helpful for our industries. And ultimately, I think it'll help rebuild the American middle class if it's implemented properly.
As we look at everything going on with government, media, the threat of world wars, AI taking over everything, powers that be getting more and more power, and all these different dynamics that are coming together, what gives you hope?
Jesus Christ is the simple answer, right? And I think we as Christians, we need to rest confidently in the knowledge that God is ultimately in charge. And so, I know a lot of Christians were passionate about this election. And, I care about these things too, and I think we all should. But ultimately, even if Kamala Harris had won and had unleashed vicious persecution of the church, you know what? God is sovereign. And if it's a time for us to be persecuted, well, God's going to use that to grow his church. God's going to use that to spread the gospel to every corner of the world. God's going to use that to purify his bride. And so, yes, it's important for us to follow this stuff. It's important for us to be well informed. As Paul said, we're not ignorant of Satan's devices, but at the same time, we rest confidently in the knowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus Christ is coming back. Every enemy is going to be made into a footstool. And by the time this is all said and done, every knee is going to bow, every tongue is going to confess. And so, we need to act like we believe that, right? We should not be the people who are running around terrified about war or economic crisis. I mean, we should be concerned about these things because we love our fellow man and stuff, but we should not be the kind of people who are running around with our hair on fire, worried about this, that, or the other. Jesus is Lord, and let's say that loudly and clearly, and let's act like we believe it.
Amen. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. Our hope is in the Lord Jesus Christ. Looking forward to connecting with you again as soon as possible. May you be blessed, young man. And again, thank you, everybody, also for joining us. And looking forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. Oh, join us for Today in Prophecy, our daily news in 15 minutes or less, coming up in just a couple of hours. God bless you, everybody.